But at the time for me, it wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to be doing hands-on applied work in the community with folks who were marginalized. And I knew it, I could feel it in my bones. This is what I felt like my mission was. And so she goes, "You're in the wrong place. You should go to social work." And I was like, "Oh, all right."
Welcome to the Health Leader Forge. My name is Mark Bonica, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Health Management and Policy at the University of New Hampshire. Today's guest is my colleague, Dr. Anita Tucker, professor of social work and associate director of the Outdoor Behavioral Healthcare Center here at the University of New Hampshire. She is also a co-author of the recent textbook, Adventure Group Therapy, An Experiential Approach to Treatment. Anita was an early practitioner of adventure group therapy in the social work field, and through her research, she has been a leader in developing the practice. In this podcast, we talk about Anita's journey to the field of social work and specifically adventure group therapy. We conclude with a discussion of the facilitated wave theory that is the basis for her recent book. I hope you enjoy listening to Anita's story, and if you find it valuable, won't you leave us feedback on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you may be accessing this recording? It helps other people find us. Thanks for listening, and here is Dr. Anita Tucker. Welcome to the podcast, Anita.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here.
So, looking at your career, I just want to ask, when did the outdoors become an important part of your life? And did you kind of grow up in an outdoor family, do a lot of hunting and fishing and camping and whatnot when you were a kid?
So yes and no. I think that there was no intentional conversation around being in the outdoors. We just were in the outdoors. So I think that was part of our life. My grandmothers, both my maternal and paternal grandmothers, were huge outdoor advocates. Like my grandmother, who's 50 years my senior, so if I'm 50, she'd be 100 right now. So born the turn of the century, early 20s, she was the only woman growing up with her father, my great-grandfather, in the duck blind.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and my great-grandmother on my father's side used to bring us, my father and my aunt, and then us as grandchildren. We used to go outside. We used to spend a month in Maine at her house, which was on a lake, and we used to have to go outside for hours and collect wild raspberries and wild strawberries and wild blueberries, and then we'd hand churn ice cream with salt in the outside. And then I learned how to fish right there on that river, and I learned my great-grandfather on the grandmother who was the first in the duck line. My great-grandfather lived on a property that had two different a trout pond and a bass pond that were stocked, and we used to spend our time fishing at that as youth. And they had their own place. We had our own sugar shack where we made maple syrup on site in Vermont. So I spent a lot of my youth as a young child in the woods of Vermont and Maine with my grandparents on both of my sides. And then my father was a huge fisher and outdoorsman and boater. And I myself love the outdoors, and I'm a water person. I love the water. I was a swimmer and, swam outside, was a lifeguard, loved being in the outdoors. But in terms of formalization, I was not in the Girl Scouts. I was not kind of formally introduced in that sort of world. Anyway, as a child, it's what we did as a family. And I had really strong, brave, amazing female role models, both of my mother, who raised me a strong woman. So I owe her a lot for that, and into my grandmothers on both sides. And my dad's mom died at a young age. I was only 13 of Alzheimer's, but I just have such vivid memories of our time spent up in Maine every August with her and what we did. And she'd, go outside, and she would go have us collect turkey feathers, and then she would make her own, it wouldn't be appropriate today, but back in the 70s, she would make her own Native American headdress by hand. Sure. And stuff. By the time, we didn't know those were culturally appropriate things, but at the time, just really creative in her work and what she did. So it was kind of just not talked about, just inherent in what we did growing up.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I did not grow up necessarily doing a lot of outdoorsy things. I think I went camping in a tent maybe once before I joined the Army, so it was a bit of a rude awakening when I got.
And we didn't really camp. Like we didn't camp necessarily. We stayed at these cabins on a lake for a month long and explored the lake and kayaked and canoed and fished. So it wasn't like we didn't do like not the stuff that I've done in my career. Like I came to that sort of skill level later, definitely later in my life. But the draw to the outdoors and the calming, regulative nature of the outdoors I learned as a young child.
That's great.
Just how nice and calm. Yeah.
Well, let's circle back to that in a second. So let me ask my typical starting question. And the reason I started with the outdoors piece was because of the nature of your work. So you went to Dartmouth and studied political science and government. What drew you to that particular major?
Oh, I don't know. I think I wanted to be a lawyer.
Okay.
I don't,
pretty far from what you actually wound up doing. That's interesting.
So very far. I mean, my story is very convoluted. I did a keynote once where I kind of made a visual representation of my nonlinear path to where I've gotten. And it was very nonlinear and very just sort of seeking out as much opportunity as possible to build, my resume. So I had the skills I needed to do what I wanted to. But yeah, I went to Dartmouth. I mean, I think my love of the outdoors grew if anyone knows, Dartmouth College is located in Hanover, New Hampshire, and the Dartmouth Outing Club is probably one of the most famous in the United States in terms of their access. We have land grant, we have cabins in the woods. And so in college, we would do tons of things in the woods and outdoors. And we have our own skiway. And it's just nestled in this beautiful place. So I spent lots of times engaged in the outdoors. And so my love of the outdoors definitely grew during my college years of just being nestled on the edge of the White Mountains in Hanover on the Connecticut River, and just a beautiful, idyllic place where the value of ecology and the value of working with nature as opposed to against nature was part of the grain and fabric of the college. And this is back, 89 to 92. This is a long time ago, but it was already embedded in what they did as an organization. We have Mount Musalaki. We have Musalaki Ravine Lodge, where we when you enter school, you do a trip and then you spend the night in this cabin, and they read Green Eggs and Ham. The hut crew from the loft, because Theodore Geisel is Dr. Seuss is a Dartmouth alumni, and just all these sort of rituals that are played upon the land and the nature of, the granite of New Hampshire, and our muscles and our brains is part of our alma mater. So it really is integrated. So I just happened to go to a university where, that was part of the grain and the fabric of what that university was. And political science I was interested in because I think I wanted to be a lawyer. I mean, that was it. I wanted to be a lawyer. The funny thing about all that is, they don't have there's no social work undergraduate major. I would never have found it at Dartmouth College because it's not part of what they have as an offering. But I did know that I loved working with people. And so I ended up, what's funny is I sought out, I had this one elective in early childhood education with this professor, Andrew Garrett. And Dr. Garrett was amazing. And he really hooked me on this idea of early childhood education or engagement with youth. And so I took as many classes from him and from that education. So I, didn't minor in education, but I took as many classes as I could in education to learn about developmental theory, adolescent development, that sort of stuff, as well as some psychology classes that kind of, so even though I was a political science major, and back my junior year, I wasn't going to change majors, but I got drawn to these areas. So I was taking all my electives to just augment my skill set and my understanding of like how we worked as humans. So it was always there, but I don't think I found it till later. And then, I graduated with my, my master's. They called it government, which is, I was like, leave it to Dartmouth to have a fancy name and call it government. It was political science and anybody else's, And so after college, I found myself in Chicago.
How'd you find yourself in Chicago? That doesn't just like wake up one day and you're there.
No. So in the spring of 92, I graduated. It was really traumatic. Like I had never been involved, not traumatic with a capital T, but just traumatic from a developmental standpoint. I had never been involved with such intimate friendships before in the women. I was a swimmer in college, and those women were my family. I had created this family bond. It was the first time I had such intimate friendships. And I remember we all went on a week-long trip and no one wanted to leave each other. It was really hard to break out of, there was a very insular protective cohort going on that campus. And now I know not everyone felt that relationship at the school, but I lucked out and I really did. And so leaving was really hard and I just wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And so someone said, hey, you should travel. I'm like, oh, I should travel or do something fun. And I don't know what it was, but my father and I had traveled. I travel a lot with my father. My parents are divorced and we had traveled and we had gone to Club Med multiple times. And back in the late 80s and 90s, Club Med was all the rage. It's this, all-inclusive place you go and there's all these family villages. So we used to travel. And so I was like, maybe, I don't know. And so literally just for the hell of it, I applied. I was French speaking, it's all gone now, but I had taken advanced French at Dartmouth and I, took French since like fourth grade. So I was pretty far in my ability to not necessarily write, but definitely in being able to conversate with. And so Club Med was it's a French Canadian company and I applied and I got hired. And so I literally left in like August or July of 92. And I was situated. Me and my Dartmouth degree ended up in Port St. Lucie, Florida, working for Club Med, which was hilarious. And and there was another gentleman from Harvard, a young guy from Harvard, and he's like, "Are your parents happy about this?" I'm like, "Yeah, not so much." And he's like, "Mine either." I wasn't draining anyone. I wasn't asking anyone any for financial resources. I was making my own money, and I just wanted to explore and like literally take a mental year off.
Yeah.
So I did that for a year. I did that almost for more than a year. So I worked for Club Med until the fall of 93. So I did 2 different villages. I worked at Port St. Lucie. That was, I think it was Hurricane Andrew came through and really demolished.
That sounds right. Yep.
Demolished in the fall of 92, demolished Miami. And we had a circus tent. I mean, I have visual memories of taking the circus tent down in blinding winds because we were scared the hurricane would take it out. And then after the hurricane, really housing a lot of displaced individuals from that kind of disaster at the club with us on the east coast of Florida. So it was an interesting time. And then when my time at the club, it's a 6-month stay, was up, you kind of were at the beck. And my job was, so here we go back to that early childhood education, working with people. My job was to work with the kids. So I didn't, I wasn't teaching any sort of, there weren't swim lessons, and that was pretty much all I would be able to do. I was a swimmer from 5 to 22. So that was my skill set. In terms of athletics, I was a field hockey player too, but I wasn't going to go teach field hockey at Club Med, right? I wasn't a circus performer. I wasn't a theater person, because I had the theater part there and I didn't cook and stuff. So I went and I worked with the kids and so I worked with the kids clubs, back to my working with kids and youth and engaged, and I could speak French, so I could intersect and interact with the families who would come from Canada, who are the Québécois, mostly folks who would come and speak. So then I ended up getting randomly put, I don't get much of a choice when I was in Zihuatanejo and Ixtapa, Mexico. So then I spent the next, significant portion of my 22 to 23-year-old life in Ixtapa working at the club and exploring Mexico. And so it was a wonderful time of my life. But about a year in, I go, all right, it's time.
Okay.
It's time. I've done it. I've seen it. It's slave wages. You work crazy hours. I miss my family. I was just done. I was like, all right, time to figure out what's next. And so I didn't know what was next. And I came home to New Jersey at the time. That's where I'm from. My father lives in Manhattan. My mother lives on the North Shore of the Jersey coast in New Jersey. And came home and had a friend of mine, and she said, hey, I'm going to go live in Boulder. I said, that sounds great. So I put everything I owned, plus the dog that I had gotten in college, who was, for the last year living with my mother, put him in the car. And it was New Year's Eve of 93. And I'm like, oh, maybe I'll stop by Chicago and see some of my friends for New Year's Eve from Dartmouth, because I have a crew of folks there. And and in the drive west from New Jersey to Chicago, my good friend who I knew from my work at Club Med said, the Club Med called, I'm going to Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. I'm not going to be in Boulder. And I'm like, in Chicago, it's New Year's Eve. And I'm like, well, what do I do now? So I was literally, Mark, that is how I found myself in Chicago. Early January of 1994 in Chicago.
All right. And
Yeah.
so law school, when did law school disappear? Was that like during
So
college?
I
Like,
figured
were your folks like, hey,
I
you're supposed to
was
go to law school?
No, yeah. So
Dorothy?
I was like, well, let's make sure I like it first. So I got a job
Okay.
as a paralegal. So by
Oh,
February of 1994, I was living with a friend of mine's family from Dartmouth,
in
Malia
Chicago.
Huff. Her mom was lovely and let me live with them for a little bit until I got my bearings. And at that point, I got a job in the Loop of Chicago, and I lived on Lakeshore Drive on the edge of right in Lincoln Park on Belmont, 511 Belmont, I'll never forget, and right by Lakeshore Drive, right by the lake. It was a gorgeous place to live and to be 24, almost 20. It was a great place to be. And there was a ton of folks I knew from Dartmouth that were there. And so I got this job and I hated it. I absolutely hated it with every one of my beings. But at that point, I'm like, listen, I had done this much. I needed to like stay with a career and at least do something and bolster my resume as I figure out what I wanted to do. And so a group of young professionals I met through Dartmouth and folks, they were running, I totally forget the name of it, which blows my mind because it's been so many years. But they had this model of, I'm a young professional. I really want to give back to my community. I'm unsure how to get engaged and connected in volunteer opportunities. So there was this nonprofit started by young professionals working in more traditional sort of business law sort of areas and saying, how do we give back? Which they would give you, these are all the volunteers. So it was like a marketplace or it was like an area that everything was aggregated so we could kind of figure out what we wanted to do and how we wanted to volunteer. And so I got hooked up in this, ended up being on the leadership of it. But at the same time, I was volunteering. So I was volunteering. I was tutoring youth who were living in a corrections facility in Chicago. I was spending one morning a week on the northwest side of Chicago, working at a shelter, providing meals. And so like I was doing this in my free time and really loving it. And that's where I discovered social work. It really is where I discovered social work. Someone said, but I still thought I wanted to do education. So what ended up happening was I was doing this work and someone said, oh, you should get your master's in education. You love kids. You've been doing this work. You've been tutoring. And so I applied to Northwestern. I got I got into their master's in education program. I got into one semester and said, I hate this.
Okay. So you'd actually started in education.
I started in education. So, and I didn't hate Northwestern. That is not what I hated. What I hated was the program I was doing. So it just wasn't a good fit for me because it was a master. I think it was a master's in counseling. God, I don't remember. Isn't that awful? I think it was a master's in school counseling or something, but the whole first semester was all psychodynamic. We read all about attachment, all about Freud. Meanwhile, in my part-time work, I'm like working in soup kitchens. I'm like, when are we going to talk about like the hard issues about poverty and so I remember going in and it's the fall of 94. I go in to my advisor's office and she was lovely, and I was loving, and I'm a good academic. So I was doing great in school, but I'm like, I just don't understand what's the practical application of what we're learning. Like I was super challenging. I'm like, I'm not changing anyone's lives. I want to learn about real hard stuff. I don't want to learn about theoretical Freud. Like it's, this is some old white guy. And I know it is the basis, but it was for me, and I'm not saying psychodynamic, which is a type of intervention and a philosophy and theoretical foundation for doing individual therapy work. But at the time for me, it wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to be doing hands-on applied work in the community with folks who were marginalized. Like, and I knew it, like I could feel it in my bones. This is what I felt like my mission was. And so she goes, you're in the wrong place. You should go to social work. And I was like, oh, all right. So I was like, I went to the wrong master's program. And so then I finished my semester off, but then I'm like, what do I do? So I ended up applying to the University of Michigan, which is, a state over. They had a great master's program. I got in and then I had 6 months to fill because at that point I finished my work as a paralegal. And I was in grad school part-time and also paralegal. And then I ended up, was like by December, I was like, listen, I've been here almost a year. I'm done. I was like I think I was there 10 or 11 months doing paralegal work. And I'm like, this is awful. And applied to Michigan. And then I waited and bartended. I bartended and waited at this great restaurant, made a ton of money, lived in Chicago, had a blast. And in the fall of 95, started my master's program. But that summer, before this all went down, I had always wanted to in college. I was always very jealous of my peers and colleagues who would go on these outward bound trips. They would go on NOLS or outward bound. And I was like, you know what? I've always wanted to do that. I'm in a place where I was making great money as a bartender and a waitress. And I'm like, I'm going to do that before I go to grad school. I've always wanted to do it. It's a perfect time. I'll go in July before I start my program in August. And I did it. I self-funded a 28-day backpacking program in the Olympic National Forest, Olympic National Park in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State. We were based north of, the Outward Bound base was out there, or the Knowles base was out there. And so, I went and did a Northern Outdoor Leadership. Like literally, I'm 25 years old. Everyone else is 16, 17, maybe 19. And my instructors are the same age as I am. And I'm on this trip. And I'm like, I don't want to do 2 weeks. I'm doing the full 28. So here's this. About to start my master's. Yeah, it was really funny. And I loved it. It was awesome. It was amazing. I'm glad I did it. It was pretty life-changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had amazing experiences.
That was why I opened up the conversation, because I had kind of assumed you had been like doing backpacking kind of stuff as a kid. So this was okay. So this was your first was this like your first exposure to a really significant experience like that?
Yes, in terms of backcountry expedition, I learned a ton. Like I learned my skills on that trip for sure. I knew some of them, but I did. Yeah, that is the trip that I really learned that, the power of the outdoors, and in a facilitated manner, right? Not just recreationally, because Knowles is about leadership in the outdoors. How do we train you to be a leader in the outdoors? And so it was, yes, I strongly believe that you have to experience. If you want someone else to do something, you have to have done it yourself. So what you're asking of others. And so that's kind of Knowles and Outward Bound's philosophy is that, yes, it was a trip for me to have my own personal narrative and emotionally amazing and spiritually amazing awakening in the outdoors. But at the same time, I was learning skills that I would apply to providing the access to others to bring them outdoors. Both the technical skills as well as the group management skills that you need.
And that's the part of the purpose of the program is to teach people how to do that, to take other people out into the woods. Okay. Yeah.
Well, some of it because you learned how to survive in the outdoors and how to be a leader in the outdoors. I mean, that's what it's called, the National Outdoor Leadership School. NOLS stands for the National Outdoor Leadership School. So yeah.
Now I got to ask, so when you went to this, did you have a sense that your social work experience was going to mesh with this experience, or was it really
absolutely not?
So it was two separate experiences you were looking at?
Totally. I wanted to do it for me. Like my journey into this field was not, it was really, not at all. I wanted to do it personally for me. I thought it would be great, but I didn't even have on my radar that I could integrate the two until I got to my master's program.
Okay. So you decided to go into the master's program. So we were talking before we started recording, and you were correcting me because I had a note that said most social workers are not therapists, and you're saying, actually, no, that's not true. So you went into this program with the intent of becoming a therapist
as a clinical social worker. Yeah.
Clinical social worker. Okay. So clarify that. Help me understand that. So it just depends on the setting and what we're talking about. So I want to be really, I don't know your listenership and the scope of them, but let's talk about a US model, right? Yeah. So in the United States, for many cases, a master's level degree in a counseling degree, whether that's social work, licensed mental health, clinical psychology, marriage and family therapy, like to bill and to do clinical work, not in all cases, because social workers can provide, therapeutic services in many states if they're licensed. But for the most part, it's a model where you get your master's, which involves field work and where you have internships that you get supervised by other masters in social work who've been in the field to gain the skills you want. And there's a whole kind of, I do understand your the lack of understanding kind of the scope of social work, because social work really is a generalist sort of practice. Like I can provide therapy, but I never can forget about the context in which my clients live and the social
the social and emotional issues they might be facing in the larger social political climate, of which impacts every day their mental health. We think about, trauma and just, living in chronic poverty itself is a traumatic experience that it can impact your mental health. Living as a individual in this country who is marginalized can impact your mental health. And so social work, as social workers, what I loved about social work is that social justice spin. Like the entire field is built on the idea that social workers are built to meet clients where they're at and help them from a strength-based perspective, support them to move, provide hope, and help them understand the systems in which they are and change the systems which are oppressive, right? So it's policy work, it's community organizing work, it's clinical therapy in an office for 1 hour, but it's also so much more than that. And that's what I just loved about social work. So social work really as a field is built on that sort of understanding person and environment and how you cannot work with an individual, community, a family without understanding the context which impacts them on a daily basis, because it is such a large part of who they are and what guides them. So you have to be working at all, we call that micro, meso, and macro levels of practice, right? And so we move within all three levels at all times. And some of us do that by doing a clinical hour, but then also working with the social workers and negotiating the systems that our clients work. Some people do it at a policy level in the state house. But like I was saying, clinical social workers are the largest provider of mental health services in this country right now.
So contrast. So what I hear you saying is social work, social workers as therapists. Social work itself is very much paying attention to the where the individual is situated in society. So you're very focused on the context. How is that different? Can you contrast that with, say, the program that you had started in back at Northwestern? Do they have a different framework where they're maybe more micro focused as opposed to?
Maybe.
So you gave three levels.
I think it's a little bit of me being I'm not ADD, but me being a little bit, I want to do something. I don't want to sit still because I'm not a sit still person. And it was maybe the process was too slow for me and all of that sort of very internal brain-based, stuff that kind of psychodynamics starts kind of looking at internal processes and the id, the ego, and the superego, and it was really interesting. It's totally guided my practice. I'm well versed in psychodynamic, and there's a lot of stuff that I think psychodynamic theory has helped in just regular interventions and clinical interventions. But I think maybe it wasn't action oriented enough. Like I don't think there was anything wrong with the program necessarily. I think it was a mismatch and a bad fit for me because I wanted to be doing. And I felt like I wasn't doing. I felt like it was too theoretical. My social work program, I spent lots of time learning theory. It was very theoretical, but I felt like at the same time I was also doing and engaging in social justice. And so maybe that wasn't the focus. I think they were getting there. Maybe they didn't get there fast enough for me in my action oriented, So I have nothing bad to say about Northwestern. I really loved it. I love the fact that I'm
not trying to say it's Northwestern. I'm saying is there a disciplinary difference? So
I do think so.
Like, cause I'm trained as an economist. So I come from very much a rational actor kind of model.
Yeah.
Very individualistic kind of focus that then grows out. And I think of my conversations with sociologists who we often kind of meet someplace and we're looking at the same problems, but they come from, I think, what you call the macro, perspective of they start by looking at us as a blend of all the social factors that make us up. Whereas as an economist, I start with the individual as the unit. And I think that's you're situated differently depending on your discipline.
For sure. I do think the social justice focus, I was kind of like, I was in the field doing applied work as a volunteer and really passionate about it. And I felt like, well, I want to talk about this. And they're like, oh, well, we'll talk about that later. I'm like, why are we not talking about it now? Why are we not in our classroom having conversations about oppression and marginalization when it should, in my mind, it should be all that we talk about because it's everywhere. And I think that probably was, and I think they were getting there. But for me, it was like, I didn't want to compartmentalize it. I thought it was about everything we should talk about all the time. And so she goes, well, that is the bedrock of social work. And I was like really, really blessed to have this advisor who said, you're in the wrong place. You're in the wrong discipline.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my ignorance comes from the fact that I've interacted with a lot of people who are social workers who are not necessarily doing therapy.
No,
So like
especially
I
if you
said,
look at economy, that's going to be policy and community organizing, which would make
right.
sense into your interaction of where you're doing in terms of the economics of health and
Well,
wellness,
I'm
and
thinking of like roles in hospitals, roles in nursing homes, where it's
absolutely.
more like you're helping people access resources and you're not necessarily sitting down and talking through.
Yeah. And so a lot of social workers are case managers, and case
Right.
management is that sort of piece of negotiating systems of care. And in medical fields, that's a very common practice in social
Right.
workers, is
Yeah.
that
And that's
case
where
management.
my background is as a hospital administrator prior to coming to UNH. So
Then there's that whole, you think about it, if you zoom out a little bit and if you look closely within a hospital system, there's the oncology social worker, and then there's this person that runs groups, and then there's this person that doesn't, there's the people who work, so there are people doing direct practice within the hospital, but because the hospital is a large system, you have to understand the systems and how to negotiate. It's just like a school.
Right,
Like if you're a school social worker,
yeah.
you're not just supporting the student, you're negotiating that system, and so I think that not all social workers put out an individual sign and they do therapy in their office. I think they're everywhere. I mean, that's the beauty of social work, is that we are integrated across everywhere. Everywhere you go, you can probably find a social worker in a corporation, supporting people, and all with the same sort of goal, which is ameliorating the plight of folks that are significantly marginalized and struggling, and doing it from a place that, having the client guide us and having the client voice be so important. And
so you have
you
are a licensed independent clinical social worker, an
yes.
LICSW.
Mm-hmm.
So can you explain what that is? What does it take to become
sure.
one? And what does it allow you to do?
It allows me, well, all different sorts of things. I mean, ideally, to be licensed means that you can practice under your license without having to have supervision. So you can be independent. I could go out and ethically, in terms of field, I could transition my basement into a clinical office and have people come meet with me for a clinical hour if I wanted to as an LI. And, it's usually traditionally folks get 2 years, and that's pretty much licensed clinical workers, whether it's licensed marriage and family therapists, licensed social workers, licensed psychologists, licensed mental health practitioners. Usually it is, you finish your work of school, your graduate school work, which again is a professional degree, where you have an internship, usually 2, if not, 2 internships or 1 elongated one, where you're supervised by someone, and then you graduate, and then you go out into the field and you continue to be supervised by someone. So it's usually around 2 years of full-time work, where you have 1 to 2 hours of one-on-one supervision, so that you're gaining and still engaging in your skills. And then you sit for licensure for both an exam, and then you have to have documentation and evaluation from the supervisors that supervise you. And then you become licensed, and it's state by state, and every state is different. Like in California, I still think, and I could be wrong, but I think there's an oral exam in California to be a licensed clinical practitioner. So each state's a little different, but all states require a certain degree, a certain amount of coursework, and then a certain amount of supervised practice experience hours in the field, working with, whether that's group therapy, individual therapy. And not everybody who has a social work degree cares about licensure, because they're not doing that sort of work, nor do they worry about billing or being able to, that sort of stuff. So that's pretty much the path for licensure. And and so I got my license in 99, I think. It's been a long time. It's been a really long time since I was licensed. And I was licensed post MSW, working in Boston. And
so you show up at Michigan, and you're first day of class, let's see, first week. Okay. So you've got a professor who's teaching a course called social work in schools, which is kind of where you had thought you wanted to be. Takes the class outside and runs an exercise called stepping stones, which is something I've actually done with students too. I love the kind of outdoor education stuff. So what was this particular iteration of stepping stones, and why was it kind of a formative moment for you?
Well, first of all, I'm outside. I went to Dartmouth. Like, I went to Dartmouth where you literally were taught by these amazing, brilliant people. I mean, like literally in the late 80s and early 90s, my professors did wear, the blazers, the tweed blazers with the elbow patches. I mean, it was a very different time. And so education and, and I am a great in the classroom learner. Like I am traditional education, was great for me, not for everybody, definitely not for my children, but for me, I just always thrived. I was very intellectual. I loved class. I take tons of notes. I love engaging. So I was a studier. I have a great memory. I did great on my SATs, like that sort of education. So Dartmouth was a great fit for me because I learned that way really well. And so when I got to my master's, all of a sudden I was just being like, this is grad school. So for me, I was just like so out of my comfort zone in terms of what I thought formal education was. So that was the first thing, like, what's going on? This guy's crazy, right? And then once I saw what he was engaging in, I was like, wow, this is super powerful and way more formative than being lectured at.
Okay. So briefly describe stepping stones for people who don't know what that is.
So sure. So and I'll frame it. So in adventure-based work, we utilize adventure activities, some sort of kinesthetic, holistic engagement through activity, especially adventure activities, whether that's problem solving, initiatives, which I'll explain, which is stepping stones, climbing, the challenge course, all those sorts of things are tools of our trade. It's the same sort of way we do it. We have different tools. So in this case, Tony Alvarez, my professor at the time, was using, he said, listen, you're going to be school social workers and there's a journey that you're going to go on and you're going to need a variety of different tools to be successful in this career as social workers. So he had us all stand in one place and he put a rope around us. And then he literally took out like a 2x4x8, 4 car mats from his car, a couple of classroom chairs, 2 milk crates. And he basically said, these are your tools. These are the tools that are going to get you, and you have to work as a group because social work is a shared experience and we need to use our resources. We do not live in a silo and we have to understand the impact of community. So he kind of framed it in that way. And he said, so these are the tools that you need, but so there were these concrete items, but then he did the metaphor thing saying like, listen, what do you think? He had a really good conversation with us. What do you think as a group, if you want to do school social work, and some of us were in internships where we understood the impact and the complexity of working in schools, what are needed. And so then we started to describe the resources we really need if we were really successful. And so we were like, communication with, access to students, communication with the parents, I don't know, all different. So we labeled all these things, not as a milk crate, but as a resource with masking tape, right? So we wrote on these inanimate objects what they metaphorically represented as resources. And he said, listen, you need to use these resources as a group to go from this point to that point, which is a metaphorical travel. And we physically use them, but the key was at no time can you lose contact with any of these resources. If you stop touching them or standing on them or anything, they're gone and you're not allowed to touch the ground, right? So they're keeping you afloat metaphorically in your journey and you're trying not to drop them. So you as a group had to figure out how to move all these objects. Once you stepped over the rope, you had to step on or use these tools and then make it all the way to the other rope. And so it was this big group initiative where we had to passing over this lawn. It was just, and making sure that no one, people would get to the front of the line and then forget the thing behind. So that resource was gone. And now we needed it at the front of the line. So there's a lot of body proximity and holding on to each other and trying to negotiate this field. So there's a lot of shared experience in that. And I grew to understand my classmates a lot, but a lot of reflection. Of course we lost a few things and we had the debrief at the end of we call that processing of kind of you put in the outline for today, this idea, the experiential learning model of what, so what, now what. So it's kind of so what happened? Why is it important? And how does that apply to future application? Right. And so we had that conversation and I was like, this is so cool. It felt so powerful.
Yeah.
And then in that context, he said, and this can be a hike. And then I was like, oh, a hike. And so then my ears perked, the whole idea of nature. And I remember for the first time in that class being like, oh my God, my love of the outdoors and the ability that nature provides and regulation can be used as a therapeutic tool through activity in this forum. And I didn't even know. And that's when I heard the first term of what adventure therapy social work practice was. And that was it. That was the fall of 95. And I have never turned back. And it's now 26 years later. And it was that gentleman who I just wrote a book with, right? So here we are, years and years ago. And the reason Mark's talking about this is because my introductory chapter is a narrative about that experience between Tony and I so many years ago.
So this is Tony Alvarez, who is one of your co-authors on the textbook Adventure Group Psychotherapy, an Experiential Approach to Treatment. And we're going to hopefully get to that if we don't run out of time. So you go through your master's program. Do you continue to build on this? Was Michigan, were there practitioners of Adventure Group Psychotherapy? Was Alvarez, I assume, is a practitioner?
He spent at that time, he was a school social worker. He was an adjunct. Okay. He was full-time faculty, but he also had a practice on the side. So there was also another class I took with Brett Seabury, which was metaphors in social work. So there was this ability, and I was in the clinical track. I was in the child and adolescent track to do this work. So I knew I wanted to be a practitioner providing therapy with children and youth. I knew that's what I wanted to do. And then I realized I wanted to do it experientially. So I, soaked up as much work as I could. So I took that class, I took another class. It became the summer of 96. And I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I was moving back east for the summer. And I had friends in Boston. So I was like, maybe I'll move to Boston and be with some of my high school and college friends. And I ended up applying for this job at this place called Camp Runningbrook Academy. It changed names during the times I worked in there. And they basically, the executive director of the camp was an MED or an EDD. So he had his doctorate in education, and he believed in the importance of experiential practice and work. And he ran this camp, and it was mostly with at-risk and marginalized kids who really struggled academically and behaviorally. And so he's like, listen, you're a social work master's. You like this work. I want you to run the challenge course. And I was like, what? I don't even know how to run a challenge course. And he said, listen, I'll send you to Project Adventure, to their adventure-based counseling workshop in Beverly, Mass. So I was in Mass. He's like, Beverly, Mass. And at that time, Project Adventure was really, this is 96. They were the forefront of expanding adventure-based counseling, which was what they were calling it at the time, which is adventure therapy, basically. And I'll send you this training. You'll get the technical skills to be able to work on the challenge course, as well as the facilitation skills to be able to run the activities. I said, okay. He's like, listen, I'll pay for half of it. If you come back next summer, I'll pay for the second half. I was like, sounds great. So I went to this workshop, which was amazing. And it was a 5-day workshop up in Hamilton, Wenham, Massachusetts. And it was great. I was like, this is definitely what I loved it. Had a great summer, really hard work, really hard kids, but a great summer. Went back to my second year, and I had an internship in an intensive outpatient program, which is a step down from inpatient hospitalization. I was working with adults with pretty chronic and persistent mental illness. And I said to my supervisor, I want to integrate experiential work. And we did it. And I would do these games and activities in this room with these adults. And it brought joy and reflection. And, I was trying my skills, and she didn't know anything about it. And so we were just processing it together, and she was learning while I was doing, and it was awesome. And so my second year internship, I was able to integrate it as well. Went back after I got my MSW, finished a summer there. And then my fall and my spring of my second year of my MSW, I had decided that I really wanted to get my doctorate because I really liked research. So all this was going on. And then I had this love of research, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. So I applied and got into Boston College and started that fall at BC.
So you went straight basically from MSW to PhD.
Yeah, but as I got into that process, I realized I'd made a mistake, and then I didn't have practice experience. So it's the fall of 97. I'm starting my PhD, and I was like, I made a mistake, but I wanted to gain. So I said, I'm going to do something. So I'm starting in the fall. I was working with a faculty member, and I literally I think it was December of 1997. At that point, I had spent, so just to frame it, I had spent 2 summers at that camp, gone back, and had at that point multiple trainings with Project Adventure. And so at the time, they were the local resource. So I was living in Boston, clearly, getting my doctorate And I drove up in my car, I'll never forget, and arrived in Hamilton, Wenham, and knocked on the door and said, hey, I want to intern for you all. But I have my MSW. I'm not counting carabiners or flaking and coiling ropes. Like, what can you do? And they said, well, why don't you go over there? And at that time, there was a trailer on the property. And I went up the ramp into the trailer and met Jim Scholl, who literally is the founding father of adventure-based counseling, and became fast friends with him. Yeah. Okay. So I met Jim Scholl, and he took me under his wing. And then I met Lee Gillis that he was working. Who was another practitioner in the field. She was a leader in the field, along the likes with Mike Gass, who's a colleague of mine. Like, they were all colleagues at this time. I did not know Mike Gass at that point. And he brought me in as a therapeutic strand intern, which they'd never had. So it was like this new thing they created for me. And so then I started running groups at a Montessori school. I started doing research for them on my days of my doctorate. Back then it's 97, like Lee Gillis was like, wanted to make a database with all the doctoral dissertations on adventure at the time. There was not much published. And so I was getting into doing all this research. And Jim's son at the time was working at this organization in the Raleigh, Mass called North Star Adventure. And I said, well, maybe I'll intern for them. So I reached out to this guy, Tom Healy, who was the director of North Star. And I said, listen, I have my MSW. I'm volunteering my time for Jim Scholl, but I'd like to work. Maybe can I intern for you? And so he's like, sure. Let's do it, And so in like March of 1998, I literally started interning, like being a free worker while I was getting my doctorate for this organization. And by May, he hired me. It was so fast. He's like, so then all of a sudden I had this clinical job doing full-time adventure therapy with kids involved in foster care, residential treatment, Department of Mental Health, as well as the juvenile justice system in the North Shore of Mass, as south as Lynn and all the way up to Gloucester. And I did that for a long time and I loved it. And I was going, because it was a part-time doctoral program. So I went every Thursday, I went and did my classes and then worked, and then by years later, I was then the clinical director and, running the program and a full staff of students. And that's where I met Dr. Gass. I met Mike Gass because he used to come do in-service training for us at North Star and train our staff. And then, Tony, I was still friends with him. He'd come out and I would bring him out and we do presentations at different local conferences, both in social work and experiential ed. And he'd come train my staff, so I was still connected to my Michigan roots. And so that's where, so I did that work for a long time. Loved it. Absolutely loved it.
So a couple of things. First was you made a kind of a passing comment about gathering a database of adventure therapy dissertations. So, and you said there weren't that many. So this is a relatively new therapeutic intervention, adventure therapy.
Especially in social work.
Okay.
Especially in social work.
Who was doing it prior?
Lee Gillis, Mike Gass, and family therapy and psychology.
Okay. All right. So a different discipline.
And not a lot. There's just not, okay. There was no, Dr. Gass, I can go get Dr. Gass's book. It's on my bookshelf over there. I think that was published in 1994. So his first adventure, which is an edited textbook of different chapters by different writers. So that was the first textbook that was kind of written in the field. And that and along with Jim Scholl's adventure-based counseling called Islands and Healing Adventure-Based Counseling, those were all, that was it. There was nothing in the field at the time. Dr. Gass, Dr. Gillis, and Dr. Keith Russell now have a seminal textbook kind of on the theory, research, and practice of adventure therapy, but that published in 2012.
So you were really in the early stages of this intervention becoming kind of mainstream.
Yeah, and when I was at my doctoral program at Boston College, they would just send everyone who was interested in Anita, go talk to Anita. She's our adventure lady, because they didn't really know. There was nothing going on in the grad school. They didn't know anything about it, and so I had this job. I would commute north from Brighton in Boston on Comm Ave to go work, and then do my. It was a crazy time in my life. I loved it. I have such great stories, and actually, what's funny, so. Dr. Michael Young, who works at Cooperative Extension at the University of New Hampshire with me and Mark, him and I used to work together. We've known each other forever. I used to have lunch with him last week. You can bring kids out into the woods. I've known Mike Young since 1998. So he knows my husband because I met my husband at my job. So it's a funny little small group. And at the time, no one was doing it. And if you were doing it, there's no way you didn't know each other.
Okay, so you're like at the cutting edge of a field at the time.
Oh, for sure.
And your faculty, you're getting you're getting a PhD. Your faculty's like, yeah, go see Anita. So you're a student. How did you put together a dissertation committee? Like everybody's like, well, tell us about, teach us Anita. I mean, that sounds like
I will tell you. So I had a lovely advisor in my master's and my PhD program, Dr. Betty Blythe, who just retired from DC. She was amazing. And she got me involved in her research, which was home-based interventions for youth in the foster care system. And it matched because I was running groups. I was literally doing home-based interventions with kids in foster care and running 9-week groups with kids in foster care placement. So I understood the life of these youth because I was doing it as a practitioner, right? And so we were evaluating this large thing. We were evaluating a multi-million-dollar grant that they got based on the home builders model out of Seattle, which is an intensive family preservation intervention. And so the actual, which was, fortuitous, the grant was based out of Detroit. So I used to fly out to work because I was her evaluator. I was on the grant. I used to fly out to work to go to the court, to go to family court where they used to randomly assign kids to foster care, traditional treatment, or intensive family preservation services, meet with our research group and see Tony because he was in, so I had all that data. And I was verged on finishing my PhD and I just had no love for it. I just didn't love it. And I gave it to a colleague of mine who then subsequently finished her PhD like a year later. It took me 9 years to finish my doctorate because mid-flight, I said, I don't even know if I want to be a PhD in social work. And I really don't like this research, even though everyone says a done dissertation is a good dissertation. And I said, yeah, but it's not what I love. So as I able to have more power and responsibility in my organization, started collecting data. I started collecting data with my foster care kids. We did Gresham and Elliott social skills checklist, as well as what's the other one? I should know my dissertation research rate. Isn't that bad? It's been a while, folks. It's 2006. But I collected data and I used that to get my PhD.
Okay. All right.
And but I will tell you, in my proposal, to get back to your question, and I'm long-winded, so I apologize. I wrote 100 pages on the history of adventure therapy.
In your proposal?
I had to build an argument for why it was even a field. It was so long. It was 100 pages of a proposal.
So your faculty are like, this is not a thing. And you had to be like, this is a thing. It is a thing, right? Here's 100 pages on why it's a thing.
And then guess what? It didn't make it into my dissertation because they were convinced and said it wasn't necessary.
Well, I guess that's a good thing, right? They're like, okay, it's a thing. You don't have to give us the
it's
background.
A lot. It's too much for you. Yeah.
Okay. That's cool. All right. So I want to ask you a little bit. So I want to really backtrack a minute. Why therapy? What made you decide to be a therapist? So it kind of, because you had bounced from, you hit Northwestern, you were starting to head into therapy. You eventually wound up at MSW as a therapist. Like, what was it that drew you to therapy?
I probably, like everybody else, wanting to help people. There's the what everyone says, and then there's the real reason. Most people have had some sort of traumatic event in their life, and a therapist has been impactful, and they're like, that might be a good career. And that was my journey. I had some, we all have our stories, and my story was, significant childhood trauma, and was able to access really great resources and realize this is a time to heal my own trauma, but also use this and skills to help others, which you might have similar lived narratives. What I became really, really aware of in my MSW program is that you really have to do your own healing around your trauma to be able to not bring that into your clinical work, because then it becomes about you and not your clients. And so there was a real journey in my MSW. I got to my fall and I said, I'm going to do this work. And I found they really invited it. They said, listen, one of the, in psychology, they used to, I don't know if they still do it because I'm not in that field anymore in terms of clinical psychology. They used to require you to be in your own therapy while you get your master's so you can learn. Like, again, it's hard to have someone else do something unless you've done it yourself. And I do believe that's important. And so I had this great clinician that I found, but they offered us, as MSW students, they gave us a list of clinicians that offered sliding scales for students. They gave you the resources. Like, it wasn't like this was new to them. And so I had this great clinician. So I spent a lot of my master's program really unpacking all of that to make sure that I was entering the field for the right reason, not to help others so I could heal myself, but help others because I truly believed in the importance of doing that. So a lot of self-reflection and journey. And I just knew that I was good at it. I had good insight, but I wanted to learn the theories. Like I kind of knew why I would say and do things, but I wanted to understand the theoretical underpinning of why it worked. Like there's, you do something because you think it's the right thing. And I'm like, oh, that's why that works, because there's a whole understanding of the basis of why that intervention works the way it does because of theoretical contrast.
I mean, that's the wonderful thing about education, right? Is it kind of, we teach theories and people, that's the best thing about,
to see them come alive is amazing, right? You're like, oh, that's supposed to learning.
Now
That's what
it,
reinforcement
right?
looks like. Oh,
that's the best thing to see when you see the lights come on in the students when you're talking, whether it's, I'm sure, whatever the discipline is. So what was the hardest thing about becoming a therapist? What was the most challenging part of your training for you?
Oh, I think that the trauma responses and having to really do that work of being like, all right, I feel this, because trauma shows up in the body and it shows up in the psyche and it shows up in behavior and it shows up in our thoughts. And so really like having a really honest and transparent conversation with myself about, I don't want to carry this around for the rest of my life. I want to do good work. I want to have a healthy and adaptive existence on this planet. And so I, really not shying away when you really do the deep dive and you don't shy away from the hardness of it. It is exhausting. Best thing I ever did though. And, I've been in and out, over my doctorate, so I found a therapist in my doctorate program because I was like, I really enjoyed that. And so then, I kept, and then, I can call her up and say, hey, do you have just 10 minutes or an hour? And she'll see me just on the phone if something comes up. And so like, knowing how to have that objective third party who knows you well enough to say, this isn't anything about you, or, that thing you do is coming back to haunt you. Let's talk about it and unpack that. And so It really is, it's really hard work. And I still to this day, walking through the world and trying to walk your talk and really be open and honest and transparent and vulnerable. I really pride myself on trying to be as vulnerable and authentic as possible and transparent in my work with my clients and my work with my faculty and my family. It's hard work and it's exhausting. And I think my newest journey is kind of figuring out what it's like to be a white woman with privilege walking in a world where so many around me don't. And like, that's kind of my new, I'm not in therapy for it, but maybe I should be. Maybe I should to really do the anti-racist work that I want to do. It's hard work. I'm already finding it to be really hard work. So I don't know. I don't want to be a reactive person that walks around this world kind of not being safe or approachable. And so it's just a lot of work, but yeah, I thought I was good at it. I felt like I knew what I was doing. Once I learned the theory, I found myself to be even better about it. And then once I really did my work, I was excellent at it. Right. Once I didn't bring myself and I knew what I was doing.
So that's so that's a question I like to ask providers, clinicians of any sort. Is like, when did you really know, when were you able to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I'm good at, I'm a therapist. So I asked physicians, like, when did you know you were a physician? I was like, it obviously wasn't, well, maybe not everybody says it, but like, typically they'll say, it was not when I got my MD, after medical school, it was
I would say my second year in my MSW running those groups, I came to the realization that I am really good at running groups. I will say I am not an individual therapist practitioner. I do not like individual therapy. I will do it. It's not my skill set. I am a group practitioner. I like to use the group to provide meaning and I like to give ownership and expertise back to the group as opposed to being the expert myself. Like I always found I was always uncomfortable. And I think in the way therapy can be misrepresented is that, good therapists are not the experts in their clients' lives. The clients are the experts in their clients' lives, and they reflect that back. I think many clients come to a therapist hoping that the therapist will solve their problems for it, and they want to give it over to the therapist and have the therapist do that. And as much as I would say to my individual clients, that's not my role, I found that was a lot of responsibility, and I felt uncomfortable with the responsibility. I personally felt uncomfortable with the responsibility, and I felt in group work there was shared responsibility, and I liked that, and I was good at that. And I love really good individual therapists. Wow, I give them credit. That was not my wheelhouse. My wheelhouse was group work.
So are most people either one or the other?
No, a lot of people do both. And I did both.
Yeah.
I totally did both. I didn't just do, but in terms of expertise, I'm a good group facilitator. I'm a good group therapist. So you have to kind of do both. Like there's some things you don't want to unpack in a group. Like you have to do both. There's some things you really don't like, especially around trauma and shame and stuff. There are times when the audience should be you and that client, and it's not really needed in the group. And sometimes that would mean referring my clients out to other individual therapists. And sometimes that would mean doing it myself, but I knew I was never going to open up a private practice where I just met with clients for 1 hour, and not just, so I'm minimizing, that's really important work, but that wasn't going to be my work.
That wasn't going to be your practice. You weren't going to be an individual practitioner. Okay. Mm-hmm. When is it appropriate to use group and when it is appropriate to use? So you kind of, I guess you kind of answered that just now, like some of the stuff you don't want to do in public. So,
well, the client has to be able to handle group. I think we talk a little bit about in the book, we talk a little bit about it, and we had a really long conversation. I mean, I wrote with five other colleagues were all licensed mental health practitioners in different disciplines, and three of the six of us have doctorate degrees, right? So we are a group of really advanced practitioners, and we had that conversation because we aren't naive enough to think that adventure therapy is going to be the be all and end all for all. Like there are, if you don't, first of all, some folks may not want to share their therapist. It may not be that they may need that one-on-one time. They may need that attention. It may be too much for them to really be in a group process where, they just might need the attention. Group work might not be appropriate. Sometimes they're too triggered and they're not regulated enough to be able to handle other people in a group setting.
What's best for groups?
There's a lot of different reasons.
Yeah. So what's the best condition or situation, person, who would you say, your problem, your personality, whatever, you'd be best to go to a group. You'd be well taken care of in a group. What's the best kind of condition or situation? I think
anybody can be in a group if you create the environment that's appropriate for what they need. And so I think that's a depends. That's a gray. Okay. That depends, right? So there's no clear answer to that, because you could create a small group of 3 people, which isn't really a big group that they could handle. I think as a diagnostician, it's hard to put a clear parameter around who makes for a good group and who doesn't. You really have to ask the client in that sort of assessment phase of whether or not they'd be good. This group, this is what you'll be asked to do. Do you understand that? Does this feel right to you? And have the client guide if that sounds exciting to them or that just seems overwhelming to them. Some people, it might be overwhelming to have to show up in, I work with youth. My clinical examples are youth, but sometimes it's overwhelming to show up and be vulnerable with peers. They don't have the ability to do that. So that's not a person that would be good in a group. Or they have they're very explosive and have no frustration tolerance. I might need to work with them individually to be able to build up that resource before they get into a group, because all they'll do is blow up the whole group. And that'll just be death. So then what will they think? I'm a loser. I can't even make it to the group. So it's so independent of the client and what they present and whether or not they'd be a good fit. So there's no rhyme or reason. I do think adventure-based provides, if done correctly, provides a safe avenue for people to try on new skills they may not have had before, learn it in a safe environment, perhaps fail and not do it appropriately and learn from that and adapt, so it's a safe place to try on new things, because ultimately we can't stay in group forever. What do we want people to do? Go out in their community and learn skills that they can practice and learn, skill rehearsal in a group setting, and then apply it into their larger life in situations in which they're not being successful because how they've adapted is not working for them anymore. So can we provide them a way of learning new ways to do that?
So what about adventure therapy? Like, is there you've mentioned working with young people. and that's your specialty. But like when somebody says group therapy, I immediately think of like an AA meeting with people sitting in folding chairs in a
And that's
church basement.
that's talk group therapy.
Right,
and a lot
right.
of the talk group therapy and traditional group therapy, like parameters or construct, they transfer over. I mean, so Irvin Yalom has this, seminal book on group therapy. And, he talks about, and there's been iterations of it, but he talks about, a group is a social microcosm of what happens. So if I'm acting out in the classroom, you put me in a group, I'm going to act out in the group. And what a great time for you to, so it's like a mini social microcosm of the larger world. So if you can, in that environment, fix it, you can hopefully transfer it out. Like, so there's all these things in a group setting that actually show up, but, and an AA group is kind of it's a task group or a self-help. It's a self-help group actually. And the cool thing about AA is it's shared experience. It's, I am not alone, right? And that transfers over into all group therapy. I am not alone in this. I am not the only one struggling with this. You also get in trouble in school. Oh, you get dysregulated too and get angry. Oh, and so those sorts of pieces, well, I'm learning how to do it. I'll share what I know with you. This is what, all that sort of interpersonal dialogue doesn't happen in individual therapy. It happens in a group setting, that shared experience, that learning. Like, so all that transfers over to adventure. But the difference is that through activity, the client shows up holistically. If they're argumentative, they get in arguments when they try to figure out a problem they're solving. If they don't listen to directions and put their rain jacket on the top of their backpack, they get soaking wet on their hike. If they're, it just shows up. And you can immediately, in the moment, talk about it. If I sit with a client who comes in to talk to me, they're going to retrospectively discuss something that occurred to them that I did not observe. And I'm going to try to understand from their perspective and work with them to work through what showed up, what happened, and how do you work moving forward. In a kinesthetic engagement experiential activity, it just shows up and you have all of this information. Do you play games with your family? Think about what happens when you play a game with your family. Everyone shows up, right? That is diagnostic in and of itself and a place to learn and grow by saying, wow, I know what happens when I know what happens when we play golf as a family with my two sons and my husband. I laugh. I go, oh my God, we all need adventure therapy, folks. Like, we just laugh, like, because we're fighting and this and that, so that's kind of the theoretical construct is like people show up in the group and the activity allows us to bring to the forefront or highlight both strengths, because you got to remember in adventure, we really want to talk about strengths, the adaptive ways they show up and the resilient ways they show up, which maybe they don't realize or no one's paying attention to because it's so around, deficit based. Like in adventure, we're like, not only, yes, this is non-adaptive. So you do this when you're fighting, like you're in a canoe and you're fighting with your partner, you're going in circles. That is the most diagnostic, like what happened? We're waiting for you and you guys are fighting. Well, he's doing it. And I'm like, oh, so what other parts of your life does that happen to you? And why do you think it happens? And is it working? Well, no, we were in circles for 2 hours. I'm like, right. So those sort of magical moments,
metaphor
activity,
right.
The metaphors just show up.
Yeah.
But really that the clients show up, you allow them to show up as they are, and you ask them with curiosity, like Tony Alvarez and Gary Stouffer, the first and second author on the book. This is their kind of model. But what they've always taught me is they go to clients and say, I'm curious and I'm noticing without any judgment. Like they're narrating what they're seeing. And in a talk therapy setting, there's nothing to see. There's something to dialogue around. And so for me, I just feel like it's magical. And even if bad stuff goes on and it's a mess, but all that information you're learning about, it's all good information of saying, this is how these folks, this is what they're struggling with. This is what they're good at. And let's name it for them. So oh yeah, you're right. What do you think you need moving forward? Well, let's practice that. Have you thought about that? Or you were successful and you weren't Joe. What did you do differently than Samantha did? all right, well, let's, that sort of noticing and then putting it into practice, and then hopefully them getting success in whatever activity it is. And, we scaffold adventure, right? We start with smaller challenges and build up to larger challenges, both emotionally and not always physically, but definitely emotionally. Like I might just throw someone in the trees if they're substance abusing individuals in recovery, because they like the high of the adrenaline rush, the dopamine hit of climbing.
Oh, neat. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I might do that, but I may not ask them to share emotionally intimate stuff because they're not ready, but I might physically challenge them, but not. So we scaffold the emotional challenging part of it, what we ask of them, and authenticity, right? Okay. So they have skills they build, and then we ask more of them to be able to manage more dissonance per se, more discomfort, more challenge emotionally, right?
Can I ask, so I'm thinking about with adventure, what you said about bringing I forget the wording you used, but like they bring themselves or something along those lines.
Yeah.
It makes me think of Irving Goffman's like on stage, off stage model, where like you can, if I'm sitting in a chair in a room, I can pretend a lot.
Can bullshit Chris. You can BS your way through anything.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So there's not a lot of, whereas if I'm up physically doing something, my mind is not necessarily on how am I presenting. No,
you're in the moment. And there's a somatic, there's a somatic response. Like there are things that happen in our body when we use our body, when we engage in our body, and we, that nervous system activation, especially in trauma, like in adventure now, like it's not what happened, it's when did it happen? Like everyone has trauma in their life. Like with our clients, if they're in therapy, we're knowing there's got to be some sort of trauma history. It's inherent, unfortunately, what's going on in the world right now. And so from a trauma-informed lens, adventure allows, we want to know what people are thinking, how they're behaving, and what they're feeling, but we also want to know how they're physiologically feeling, the somatic engagement. So that 4 areas of a human being we can engage in adventure. And you can't hide, which is what you're kind of saying. You can't, you can't necessarily hide.
You can't hide. And I think the mask comes off kind of automatically, but that might be
not
overwhelming as well.
But it can be overwhelming, and you're for sure. Like you have to be careful.
And I was reading in your book, you talked about an example of a young guy who was doing an exercise that kind of overwhelmed him. He wound up running out of the room, and I think you all had to follow him. Somebody had to follow up with him, and there was kind of a breakthrough, but at the same time, it was too much exposure. Maybe if I'm understanding it correctly.
Yeah, it was an individual who had sexual trauma, and he was they were all doing this all aboard, which everyone's getting a small piece, and he had someone's crotch area in his face, and it trauma, and he had a somatic response and a trauma reaction, and and didn't even realize, yes, but also the thing about you can prepare for the best, but you never know what's going to happen. That's the beauty about adventure, but it also, you have to do it very delicately, because you have to, in a trauma-informed lens, I will be like, listen, we're going to ask you to do this. This is what, so had Tony, was Tony's student in one of his schools. If he were to do that now, he would have done it differently, because he would have said, hey, we're going to do this. It might look like this. I want you to understand what's coming, and then make your choice of how you're going to proceed. That trauma-informed understanding of what we're going to ask you to do, as opposed to, hey, does someone want to volunteer? I'm like, I'm not volunteering for anything unless you tell me what I'm volunteering for. And if someone has a trauma history, forget it. Because all of a sudden, then they're in the middle, they're up in front, or whatever it is, and they have to respond. And if you have some sort of emotional response, there's shame and all that sorts of stuff. So we're learning a lot around how to, but you can never prepare. You can never know. You have no idea what's going to happen. You just have to understand that things can come up and be ready for them, and then understand, and be gifted in the ability to still create safety for that person. So
the role of the therapist in adventures, I mean, you don't have full control over what's about to happen you have the individuals who are in the group, you have the exercise, all sorts of kind of chaos can ensue, which is both productive in the sense of like that's part of the therapy.
That is part of the therapy.
Right. But at the same time,
it's controlled chaos.
Right. I don't mean like it's.
Yeah, no, I know. We call it controlled chaos.
Controlled chaos.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So but your role is to control the chaos.
Your role is to keep it safe. To keep like your role is many things, right?
Okay.
It's to mirror, to be curious. The first role of everything is to keep it safe, I will stop activity if it is unsafe emotionally. I mean, like you might be doing, and I'd be like, wait a second, I am stopping. So you are the ultimate expert who keeps it safe. But you don't just show up on a challenge course without having you build and scaffold a group contract. What are our norms? How are we going to talk to each other? What, are you bought in? Like we do all that before, in the process of building activity. And as we give them more challenging things to do, they have this kind of scaffold based of safety and expectations and knowing what's expected of them. And hopefully positive experiences where conflict has ensued. We as facilitators are modeling them how to manage conflict. Conflict won't kill you. There's a way of managing it. There's a way of doing it in a respectful way. And so those are, that idea of building on small successes provides an opportunity to gain more skills in more stressful situations so that they can manage more stressful situations outside of the therapy group.
Very cool. So I want to give you a minute to talk about the book, because that was kind of the impetus of our conversation.
Yeah.
And I've just enjoyed listening to everything you're doing. It's just absolutely fascinating. But I do want to give a minute. Tell me about the book a little bit. I don't think we're going to be able to get into all the details that I had originally thought about, but what was the impetus of the book and who's it for?
The book is 20 years in the making. It literally is Tony Alvarez and Gary Stouffer, who are two of them. It's their facilitated adventure wave model. This idea that there are parts of like you have to. I mean, in a simplistic way, you have to facilitate and guide the experience. It is not just recreation where I go out and hike with you, and that was great. We guide it by what activities we choose, how we process, when we choose what activity. What are the clinical goals of the clients? Like it is intentional. Like adventure therapy is the intentional, well thought out, sequenced use of adventure activities towards clinical goals of clients, right? So it is not just haphazardly, just because I'm going to climb today and I show up and assess the group and no one's ready to climb. I'm not going to climb. Like I'm going to adapt to who showed up. So it's this idea that we assess who showed up, which is what we call the point A, both the regular assessment that we do assessment tools, but also every time we meet with a group, we do something to figure out who showed up today. And then if we need to, we deal with whatever might be going on in that group to address whatever's showing up in the community so that we can move forward in a safe way. So that might be having conversation, that might be doing activities, that might be, totally changing what we're doing for the day because they're not ready for it. I mean, if you show up and a client has someone who's died in their lives, maybe the group that day is not going to do this big activity, but instead they're going to do some sort of processing circle, or they're going to do something that's about love and collaboration. And maybe they'll do some trust work. Like you have to be able to really roll with the punches and have the skill to change what you're doing based on who showed up. And then in advance, of course, I finished a group last week. I'm going to, in advance, think about where the group is. I'm going to think about activities, and I'm going to match where they're at with the activity. So you do matching of group and activity before you show up, and then you have to adapt when you show up. Because sometimes I can still do it, but I'll adapt the rules, or I'll adapt how I present it, or I'll adapt the metaphor, or I'll adapt how we process it. Or
so
I'll say,
matching,
we need to play. The matching happens in advance, but then you adapt once you show up based on who shows up.
I was just going to say the matching example you gave earlier was with the person with substance abuse that needs the high. You're matching. You said you're going to throw them up in the trees, not literally throw them, but you're going to put them up in the trees. So is that an example of the matching step?
Yeah, knowing that that one group I had, they were so kind of irritable all the time, and just really like they were sober, but not newly sober, out of detox, but really sort of still in very agitated mode. So I needed to get them in their bodies and engaged. And so harnesses on, climbing, and then afterwards, really great depth and processing. but really just saying like, hey, we're going to do some climbing today. I just want to keep you all safe. And I didn't even do a lot of metaphoric transfer. I just said, and when we came down after they'd kind of been really regulated, because it's about like Dr. Bobby Beale, who's one of the authors on the book, would say it's about, and Kim Saxbetter, another author on the book, both of them are really into trauma and brain-based stuff, as well as Maureen Lung. I guess we all are. So I say that back, but it's all about regulate and relate. And so we need to use our relationship and the ability to regulate our clients to do true meaningful work. And then we can teach skills. And so in that moment, I'm like, I can't relate to these folks until they're regulated, and they're dysregulated because they're so just, so I threw them up and I gave them a dopamine hit and I made sure it was safe. And, I didn't ask too much of them, but made sure it was safe, because climbing's very safe if you do it the right way. And then when they came down, boy, was there a lot of great talking about, and Anita, I'm really glad you didn't make us talk a lot. Like they weren't, they like, oh my God, I didn't have to like check in. I mean, we did a check-in, but there was, I didn't want to like, because that's not where they were. And I said, I literally remember saying, all right, get your harnesses on, we're going up, and just changing it, because we were going to climb, but later. Right. So I totally flip-flopped it and we climbed first, right? So that's the, so I had the climbing happening. So I was matching it to what they needed, but in the moment I adapted it because they needed it sooner in the day.
So the wave starts with assessment, kind of matching, then you shape. So what's shaping?
Shaping is what are you actively always doing in that group to make it a safe space to learn? So if you think about it, like think about your classroom, like I remember taking this great training about external cognitive load, meaning that if I'm stressed as a student about what I'm supposed to be doing, what's the format of my paper, all this other stuff, I'm not learning content because I'm worrying about process and structure. And it's the same in adventure. Like if we can create an environment where they understand what's going to happen, they know they're going to be kept safe. There are ground rules. So it's the container. Shaping is really about shaping the environment so that it is the ideal environmental context so growth can happen. Because if people are worried about not having the right shoes, or I'm inconsistent. One day I'm nice, the next day I'm kind of a jerk. So they don't know what they're going to get from me as a facilitator. There's an unsafe kid in the group. Like, in shaping the environment, that might be the removal of someone who just is consistently unsafe. So we can't keep, and I don't mean nothing's ever really safe. Like I think about my colleagues of color who really are never in any space that feels safe, right? So it's a safe enough space, like a space where they know what to expect, and they know they won't necessarily be, made fun of without us stepping in and like keeping them from being hurt or that sort of stuff. So shaping is about creating nothing's perfect, but creating the environmental context where within that context of unconditional positive regard for our clients, understanding what they're going to do, trauma-informed care, no blame. Like, Dr. Bill always says, we need to stop blaming our kids and punishing them for having trauma responses. That's the same in a group. If someone's reactive and dysregulated, it's a trauma response. Like, let's stop blaming them, shaming them. And if we model that and they start to understand that, wow, if I make a mistake, I'm not going to be shamed. And wow, if this happens or that. So it's like, and that's up to the facilitator. The facilitator has to do that.
Okay.
The therapist has to create that environment.
So let's keep going with the wave. So you've got assess, match, shape. The wave kind of peaks with your facilitate.
The activity, whatever we plan for the day, right? What did we plan for the day? Are we climbing? Are we, the activity part of the portion, the major part, and then are we using metaphor? Are we not? How are we processing it? Are we debriefing? Am I going to talk about the experience, or am I going to have them? I'm going to say, like, so all those decision-making processes we as clinicians make to try to maximize the learning and potential of the experience.
And then the last stage is evaluate.
And then we say, how'd it go?
Yeah.
What do we do next?
With the clients, or is this by yourself, or a little bit of both?
Both.
Yeah.
Both.
Okay.
Client voice is important. If something's going really bad, Mark, and the thing is, we say in the book, it is not a linear process. I'm doing all of this all the time.
Okay.
So something's going, so I'm assessing all the time. I'm facilitating all the time. I'm always shaping the environment. How I respond to someone during the main activity and facilitation is also shaping my tone, what I'm noticing. Like, so it's a linear model for teaching's sake, but it's not a linear model in how it shows up. So I'm always evaluating. So if all of a sudden something, the group just like, they're circling, I will stop and say, let's evaluate what's going on. Right.
I was struck by one with adventure therapy, but maybe it's not, maybe it's not just adventure therapy. Is a couple of times in the book, you talk about the need to, I'm not going to use the right clinical word, but basically excite the participants, get them up, move, not physically moving, but emotionally
engaged, bought in, the buy-in. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Is it buy-in? I mean, because it seems like there's a level of stimulation necessary in order for someone to, because otherwise they just kind of sit, right? Or they, not physically necessarily, but there's not enough stress or enough threat. I don't know. Threat's probably definitely the wrong word,
so there is a theory of dissonance in that change occurs, change can be uncomfortable. But I would say some of that is physical discomfort and the challenge that we provide clients, but a lot of times it's the emotional discomfort of the reaction or getting in a fight, or, it's what shows up. So the activity has things show up, and then you have to process those experiences. So, and if someone's just consistently disengaged, it might be a bad fit. And we definitely have kids who are like, I refuse to do anything. And I'm like, all right, it's not a good fit for you. Like, we don't make, and the other thing is, you may be made to show up in this group, but I won't make you do anything, right? I will, so there are clients who sit and observe, and then weeks later, but at the same time, I'm still working with them and talking to them and trying to make them feel engaged. They're not, they may opt out, but there's never an opt out because they're still physically there. And then you have to remember, for that client who has social anxiety, is showing up, their dissonance. Forget engaging in adventure activity in front of their peers, just showing up. And so it looks different. And as a facilitator and a therapist, it's our job to recognize dissonance to who, and so you have to really change is personal to clients, and where they want to go is their journey, not ours. Just because we think they should go somewhere doesn't mean they want to go there, or really it means anything to them. What do they want? What is their hope? And then I will say, you're all here because you can't sit still in class, and all of you have gotten detention every day for the past month. So there's a reason you're here. Clearly something's not working from the school standpoint, but why do you think you're here? And so that client voice piece, I'm like, all right, so I'm having a hard time with my peers. Like, what's the antecedent that got them to detention is really where I'm going to focus, not on hopefully the product is, because they don't really want detention, is they have less detention. But it's not necessarily, it may be what got them there, but it's not necessarily what I'm going to work with them on. I might work with them on other things. And then the outcome is also they get less detention, and they're fighting less of their peers or their students, or, that sort of stuff. So I think it's our job to try to keep them feeling engaged and bought in. And it may not be a physical way. It may be that they're cared for, and that even though they're not engaging, we still care for them. And I'll tell you, anecdotally, in all my years of treatment, 9 times out of 10, eventually they will engage. Even to the fact that they won't do the activity, and we're brainstorming because they failed or can't do it multiple times. And then that kid who, and again, I'm sorry for all my adolescent and kid, but that's all my
base, right? So
that client will come over and be like, he'll go to me, blah 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 blah. I go, well, tell them, because he'll feel safe telling me. I go, tell them. Why don't you tell a group what you're seeing? And he'll have this brilliant understanding of the group, provide insight, and all of a sudden they're able to successfully do it. And he may or may not participate, but all of a sudden he was part of their success, even though he physically wasn't part of the activity. And so, we have to be really wary of our own expectations of change and pace. Clients will change at their own pace, and we can't get frustrated if because we have to so that's part of that. But, so I talked about my own trauma work and my own work as a professional and dealing with my own stuff. Like if you have to be able to not take it personally, not that clients are unsuccessful, but if I have goals for clients, if they don't get there, that's because they're not ready to get there. As long as I know I've done my job and I've done it well, right? So that reframe of working with a client, social work believes in meeting a client where they are and walking with them, holding their hand as they go versus pulling them, right? And so that's the same in adventure. And so how success is going to be measured, completely different idea. It's going to be individualized with each client and what they're dealing with, and we have to be okay with that. And so that's the part of engagement that really I think adventure is. There's all these opportunities for them to engage on all different levels.
That's fascinating. I could listen to you all day on this. This is just really cool stuff.
So you can tell I love it. I just find it really magical, and I love the field I'm in. And it's not for everybody, for sure, but for those it is. It's pretty impressive to watch them blossom.
Yeah. So you're at. So let's close just a little bit about UNH and the social work department. So you teach this stuff now.
I do. Yeah.
So, and you've been with UNH now 15-ish years, thereabouts.
Yeah, started in the fall of 2005, finished my doctorate in 2006. My dissertation was on adventure, used my data. And then I'm now a full professor, and my kind of backwards way of getting into the field really augmented the creation with Dr. Gass, who, again, I had a collegial relationship with because he used to train my staff when I got here with my clinical experience. And, him and I decided in 2007, after I'd been here a couple of years and kind of sprung on the tenure track, that we would start a dual master's program in social work and outdoor ed and start to help folks who want to do what we want to do, but don't, there's no clear path. Well, maybe we'll create a path and we'll create a training and a path for those folks. And so we've had that. Now it's our 11th year, and we've graduated 42 students over the course of our 10 years, cohorts from anywhere from 2 to 6, depending on the year. It's a very specialized program, and graduate students have to have worked post high school, at least a minimum of 2 years full-time in sort of the experiential world, whether that's Outward Bound, Knowles, working as a guide at a program that uses wilderness, or AmeriCorps, or we have Peace Corps folks. We have folks who are doing experiential work in schools, folks who come to us doing experiential work in residential treatment centers, but they all have significant technical skills. They have some sort of expertise in adventure, and then they come to kind of hone those skills around the facilitation and the therapy side. And they're great students.
I bet.
I just had dinner with them. And then that's all I've researched. So I've literally researched the process and outcomes of adventure and wilderness. That has been my foci for my entire professional academic career. And that I am blessed in that I have colleagues, because I am not a practitioner in the field anymore. I provide clinical supervision postmasters to folks who are doing adventure therapy. So that's why I keep my clinical license. And I do some work with the Brown Center here and there. And I teach and I publish in the field, and all that works towards my licensure. And so really my direct service right now is doing supervision with folks who want to do it and need a supervisor. Again, we talked about that journey towards supervision, those 2 years postmaster's supervised work. I work with those graduates who really need supervision so they can do this in their own practice and have someone who knows adventure versus someone who doesn't, who's great clinically, but doesn't know the nuances of that dual training of both understanding how to keep people safe and know how to run activities, which is a whole skill set, as well as how to run groups. And so that we call dual training, right? It is a dual trained modality of integration of both those skills, kind of like my Knowles and then my therapy analysis, and I have this tool.
Right.
Yeah.
Fascinating. It's just wonderful to listen to someone who is so passionate about what they do. And I mean, just exciting. So, well, Anita, thank you so much for sharing your story with me and with the listeners. And I learned a lot in our conversation.
You're welcome. It was great being here.
You've been listening to the Health Leader Forge. Please go to our website, healthleaderforge.org, for more information or to leave comments about today's podcast. Look for Health Leader Forge podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and other podcast distribution sites. Thanks for being a part of the Health Leader Forge community, and we'll talk with you again soon.